This is about who the people were that went overseas to become uh, whatever, expat teachers, expat engineers, whatever. Everyone who went overseas to teach did so for a different reason. Finding out what their backstory was became a part of the attraction and provided the basis for many good and long lasting friendships. There were definite camps. The VSO groups from the United Kingdom consisted mostly of young, fresh out of college kids who were looking for their walkabout adventure, a gap year experience, but taken after graduating. The walkabout group were high energy, spent every weekend partying somewhere, and went on vacations with their mates. They were young and brave and beautiful, and they fell in and out of relationships as quickly as they could. They were away from the family, so they experimented with making love to someone who had a different color skin, drank too much, knew that they were going home soon, and made the most of it while they had the opportunity. They would return home, write a few cursory letters, and then disappear off your radar. 3 years is a lot of more time to spend partying, and after a while, parties began to pall. The World University Services of Canada contracts were 3 years, as were many of the Dutch and German contracts, and invariably it led to more constructive relationships. The number and variety of projects undertaken by this group left a more lasting impression. Avocados, for example, grow easily in Zimbabwe's lush climate. One of the Canadian science teachers in the Eastern Highlands figured out a way of extracting avocado oil from fruit. It is a very valuable product in the cosmetic industry, and for a while his school was making a lot of money to enable them to purchase textbook and school book supplies thanks to his undertaking. Many of us found ways of accessing the mission administered funds, MAF grants, and I made use of one of these to purchase some gas ovens for Matumba so that the home economics students could actually bake as part of their O-level practical exams. Others started village bakeries by funding small commercial ovens or fixed up dams that had been destroyed by angry and defeated farmers who had fled the country during the war years. Another teacher designed stoves that burned leftovers of maize hulks and stalks. It was intimate socialism at its very best. 3 years was also enough of a time commitment for people to figure out relationships. Kate found herself pursued by a Zambian math teacher, and when baby Sarah began to enter the picture, she had to ask herself some more serious questions. Mike, our go to guy at WUSC, arranged for her to return to Canada to give birth and figure out what she was going to do. The departure left a big hole in my life, but I was at Matumba for most of her absence, and things were beginning to change for me too. On her return, Kate and Patrick got more serious, and it was with great delight that Tendayan received an invitation to their wedding in Harare at the start of the school holidays. The event itself was memorable. Arrangements had been made with a number of his Zambian cohorts, and there were legions in Zimbabwe at the time, and to perform the ceremony at a park on a Saturday and then retire to a private house in the city for the reception. The happy couple was then to travel to Livingstone in Zambia, where they would meet up with his family and further activities would take place. The justice of the peace had been booked but failed to show up at the appointed time or location. Frantic phone calls were made, and eventually a surrogate appeared at the venue sans paperwork. The ceremony took place, but the happy couple had to postpone their travels and return to the office of the Justice of the Peace on the following Monday to sign the papers along with their witnesses. The drama certainly made the wedding memorable, though I am sure they would have preferred to have done without it. However, it suited Kate's personality, and it was not only part of her charm, but also something that Africans could relate to. 30 years later, we're still good friends, and my son was living with their family in Edmonton. Kate is now running as a member of Parliament in the upcoming federal election in 2021. There were several biracial couples who returned to their home countries, and some managed to stay together, and equally others who didn't. It was definitely easier to get your spouse into Canada in the 1980s, but became progressively harder as time went by and the conservative elements in the West decided to man the barricades and keep economic migrants at bay. By the time Tendai and I returned, the cost of applying for her to enter the country had gone up by over 400% from our original application. Other relationships crumbled in the course of 3 years. Perhaps it was hardest on the families and couples who came over together. Often, while one partner had an interesting, demanding, and engaging job to occupy their time, the spouse could feel isolated and starved of company. I saw this among the missionary families based in Harare, where the mostly men were excited by their evangelical youth groups and pastoral duties. Their partners, by contrast, would be connecting up with others like themselves who were at home and alone with the children and largely bored. Their boredom was generated in part by the fact that they all had maids and gardeners, something they would never have had back in their home countries, and led them to gossip about their workers, get involved in relationships, become quite disillusioned about their marriage, and sometimes all three. I was shocked by the number of hours they required their staff to work, and they quickly adopted the old colonial habits of referring to them as boys and maids rather than use their names. It was impersonal, so they were not people to them with the same needs as they that had themselves. Sometimes they saw themselves as giving these people a wonderful opportunity to live in the city and make money. They were most offended when a child would turn up to spend the night at the lodgings in the back garden, and having whole weekends off was most inconvenient. Alex Day was a missionary who was ministering in Avondale, a substitute in Harare. We met in the coffee shop of a wonderful European bakery at the Avondale Mall, where I would treat myself to some real bread. He invited me home for lunch. I visited the family a couple of times and decided that his two teenage daughters might enjoy getting out of the city and experiencing the rural areas. The five of us fitted comfortably into their common gear, and we headed off to Chendenduma. Sue, Alex's wife, wasn't terribly enthusiastic about the undertaking, but she put on a brave face. When we reached Madziwa, Alex and I got out of the car and went to the main bottle store. It was mid-afternoon, and I speculated that several of the teachers would be there, so I could introduce them. Sue chose not to get out of the car. She also rolled up the windows, which made the car uncomfortably hot, and she kept the two girls inside. Naturally, the locals were very interested in meeting this family and went over to say hello. After a quick drink, Alex and I returned to the car. By this time, Sue was almost hysterical and screamed at us for abandoning her and the girls, as they had been attacked by all these people banging on the car. She had got out of the car and actually talked. Sorry, had she actually got out of the car and actually talked to anyone, she would have found herself being welcomed, and everyone would have wanted to shake hands with her and her daughters. Under something of a cloud, we drove on to the school, and as she watched the tar road disappear, Sue's anxiety levels rose. I gave up my bedroom to the family and slept on Kate's couch. In the morning, I returned to find them packed up and were planning to leave even before I could make them breakfast. Sue's experience of Africa would have been confined largely to cups of tea with ladies like herself and could have taken place almost anywhere in the world. I have no real explanation as to why teachers' families seem to fare so much better. Having stayed with the Gills and the Bookfinks, who sadly passed away in a plane crash not long after they returned to Telkwa, BC, several times when I visited Harare, I was able to witness what a very caring relationship they enjoyed with their servants. They found fees for the children to go to school, bought uniforms, helped out on medical emergencies, and learned how to grow productive gardens from their employees, visited their homes, and shared meals with them. There was a very real sense of loss to both parties when the contracts came to an end, and there were tears shed by the children at the loss of their much loved mentors. I am aware that this is an oversimplification and my exposure was microscopic in nature, it is what I experienced. The Salvation Army and other long term missions were staffed by many wonderful people who went over and beyond the common missionary mentality. Whereas many of the short term missionaries lived in nice houses in Harare or Bulawayo and rarely ventured into the countryside, people like Captain Carlson walked the walk. She told me harrowing stories of going into villages and caring for parents whose infants had been bayoneted in front of their eyes, whose sons had been forcibly taken as recruits, and where sexual violence against mothers and daughters alike. The long term missionaries were brave and caring people whom I greatly admired and looked up to. At the schools, there were many teachers from other African nations, both in Zimbabwe and Botswana. Some were economic refugees, especially while Kaunda was running Zambia and Hastings Banda ruled Malawi. But there were also political and tribal refugees from many nations where despots had chased away writers, teachers, and many in the educated classes. The Ngugis, Wamiri, and Wationgo were a presence in Harare and managed to organize a wonderful international book fair with Chinua Achebe as the headline presenter. At Rutwang, I had the great privilege to supervise, if such a could be the word, the wonderful Osbert Aboe, one of Uganda's great poets and teachers. This is one of his poems. What would you do? So now you're almost inverted, hell bent, your elbows creaking like an old half-hinged door, seeing the world through the vista of time, hearing the world through a watery medium, croaking instead of melodiously singing. Do you, head shaking, mutter, I wish? Do you long for those you grew up with, those hated, uncared for, those loved, who are gone, while you're hedged by yesterday's breed? Supposing to the imminent grave you are frisked away from the sunset of death to the dawn of birth, and you were to retrace your path back in time, what would you do? With your wealth of faults on your shoulders, a book of their consequences to read, your compass, the feelings you had, would you act differently? If you saw your shriveled breast sprout firm and round, saw your rivulet veins disappear, to leave behind your former dancer's leg, and your skin glistened with mature beauty, there stuck in the middle, too old to be young, too young to be old, how would you feel? Would you go back to the nightclub, go and dance the night away? Would you this time push Mutisi away to avoid Luke, whose labor was long? Or would you still chase Tony, who invested time into you? Would you feel pity or glee as your youth chariot zoomed past, your brood in their old age missile as they made their appointment with death? As you arrived at the time stage of teens, would you heed dead mama's words to tread carefully with men and instead invest all in books? Or would you sit mirror hours long, brushing the forest of hair you have, and practice pauses and smiles for Mr. Right as rice cooked charcoal black? Would you be torn between here staying and staying in the course on course to mother's wombs, as your breasts from balls to pebbles shrunk, and your round hips, boy skinny, became? Would you huff and sniff, or would you run to the boys? Run to climb and to tree climb and rope jump as your non-stop train whisked you on to the time of nose running and occasional bedwetting? Would you heed Mama's call to be clean and tame as ladies do? Would you stomp your feet and cry, I won't, I won't? As crawl time came, your language lost, your senses shallowed, would you pause and retreat, or would you merrily gun for more speed to Mama's womb? As you pause at nature's gate, feet first to zygote became, would you cry as you saw the last rays of light of the outer world before being engulfed into the warm, dark, misty grey of the womb? Oh, don't know what you do or whether your entry would be called death or birth. Sadly, Mr. Aboe passed away in Tenota the following year. And then there was Chris Rose. Chris was a veteran. We called him Prof, and we guessed him to be in his late 50s. He was the meanest drafts player in our part of the country. He would allow himself to be stripped of all but two or three of his pieces, and then he would suddenly dance around the board and obliterate his opponent while audience would emit gasps of disbelief. He had been teaching around the continent for decades and had the most marvelous tales to tell. In Ghana, one day he told us, the Lebanese had set up a lumber industry making plywood. There was a single large expensive machine that used to grade the wood, which was then sorted into piles and shipped down to the coast for sale. The machine was operated by a Dutchman, and everything went well until the machine broke down. Production stopped. The workers were unhappy because they would have to wait for the machine to be repaired before they could make any more money. Repairing North American machinery in northern Ghana could take a long time. What does the machine do? Asked one of the workers. The Dutchman described how it assessed the different grades of plywood. The worker went over to the piles of graded lumber and began to shake them. After a couple of hours, several of the workers were nodding and shaking, so they returned to the Dutchman and said that they had figured it out. He gave them a trial run and realized they had actually figured it out. He went ahead and got his machine fixed, but while he was waiting for this to happen, he was actually shipping down record numbers of plywood to the coast. His employers were mystified but delighted when they found out that by shaking the wood, the local employees could actually increase the output of the mill. Everything went fine until they changed the type of wood they were using, so the Dutchman had to return and recalibrate everything for them to continue their job. Chris had snake skeletons, piles of soil, dead birds, and tools of every kind scattered on the floor of his living room. At times, one felt a bit nervous visiting, just in case anything there was still alive. He was a brilliant teacher, and his results were off the charts. He was modest, a touch eccentric, always helpful, and had one of those minds that switched onto the on position every waking second of his life. He was capable of fixing anything, I think, except for the car I had foolishly purchased from a Canadian couple who were living in Harare. Just needs a lot of oil, they said, as I headed out from Harare and stalled 8 kilometers short of Chindanduma with no more oil left in the can. Chris had the patience of Job in trying to get the parts and fixing it, but in the end, I think it was done for. Sorry, Chris. We learned about ourselves and our values. Some of us had come in response to a call for adventure, and we found it in the national parks, in the social experimentation and relationships, and in dancing under the moon and bright stars to the best dance music in the world. Others had responded to the pictures of starvation and the urgings of people like Bob Geldof and Pierre Trudeau. Our collective political conscience willed us to pay forward at a time when the opportunity existed. It certainly cost us materially as we survived on salaries that barely covered our cost of living, and resettlement allowances kept us afloat for a few months upon our return. Yet I only, yet I met only a couple of souls who would not have declared that this was one of the most memorable experiences of their lives. I know I gave several students money to help them out. However, it paled in comparison to what other working family Africans did every day of their lives. Families slaved in small rural settings to send their children to school. Other members of the family who worked in the cities would bring home money for fees, seeds, tools, fertilizers, clothes, medicines, furniture, livestock, and anything else that you can imagine on a weekly basis because it was their duty to support their family. It was never a question of charity, it was life. I feel honored that through the magic of social media, I am still in touch with some of my former students. They call me Kule, which means grandpa in Shona, and that is a blessing. It reminds me of having had the opportunity to find and touch that touchstone of great love.